Seraphina Vance was a woman whose life was measured in grocery lists and grace. Her only ambition was to keep her small corner of the world intact, her apartment, her community, her quiet dignity, without asking anyone for a single thing she hadn't earned herself. But on a Tuesday morning that looked like every other Tuesday, a man in a tailored suit shoved a stack of legal papers into her hands inside a marble lobby that smelled of money and contempt. What Marcus Thorne didn't know as he sneered down at the woman in the cream cardigan and worn crossbody bag was that he hadn't just served an eviction notice. He had just signed his own. What he also didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the four silent men standing behind him in dark suits weren't his. They never had been. Before we go any further, if you love stories where the underdog turns out to be the most dangerous person in the room, you are in exactly the right place. Welcome to Mafia Moonlight Tales. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story, drop a comment telling me what you think is about to happen, and share this with someone who needs to see it. Now, let's get into it. Sarah Vance was 34 years old, and she had built her life the hard way, dollar by dollar, decision by decision, with the kind of quiet stubbornness that looks like humility from a distance but is really something closer to iron. She lived alone in apartment 4B of the Caldwell Arms, a 6-story brick building on the outer edge of a neighborhood that the rest of the city had decided wasn't worth remembering. The hallway smelled like old paint and someone's grandmother's cooking. The elevator worked 3 days out of 5. The radiator knocked every night at 2 in the morning like it had something urgent to say. And Sarah loved every flawed, imperfect inch of it. By day, she worked as a community health coordinator at the East Side Wellness Clinic, long hours, modest pay, the kind of job that paid you mostly in meaning. She wore her natural hair swept back and neat for work, carried the same canvas crossbody bag she'd had for 6 years, and had a way of listening to people, really listening, that made strangers feel like they mattered. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who taped notes on the mailboxes when the boiler broke, who knocked on Mrs. Okafor's door during heat waves, who showed up to every tenant meeting even when nothing ever changed. They knew her as steady. Dependable. Someone who carried her own weight and then quietly carried a little of everyone else's too. What her neighbors did not know was what lived on a chain beneath her collar, a wedding ring of black gold and a single dark diamond, a Korean design so understated it looked almost plain to the untrained eye. And in the back of her nightstand drawer, behind a novel she'd read 3 times, sat a matte black satellite phone that only ever rang from one number. She had not answered it in 6 months. She intended to keep it that way. Because Seraphina Vance was also, legally and completely, the wife of Kang Dae-hyun. You will not find that name in any newspaper. You will not find it attached to any indictment, any photograph, any public record of consequence. That is not an accident. That is architecture. Kang Dae-hyun, known in the criminal underworld of 3 continents as the Shadow King, had spent 20 years building a structure of power so deep and so perfectly invisible that most people who worked for him had never seen his face. He was 41 years old, Korean-born, and possessed the particular kind of stillness that only men who have never needed to raise their voice ever develop. He did not threaten. He did not negotiate under duress. He made offers once, in a calm and courteous tone, and then he waited to see what kind of person you were. He ran the Kang Syndicate, a network that moved through private banking, logistics, import infrastructure, and the kinds of arrangements that governments preferred not to examine too closely, from a penthouse office in a downtown high-rise that he technically did not own. He wore suits that cost more than most people's cars. He drank his coffee black. And on the upper left corner of his desk, beside his phone, he kept a small framed photograph of a woman in a cream cardigan laughing at something just off camera. It was the only personal item in the entire office. His men, the ones who moved quietly through the city watching, waiting, reporting, called her Bin. The mistress. The word carried weight in their world that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with sovereignty. And on the morning Marcus Thorne thrust those eviction papers into her hands, 4 of those men were standing 8 feet away, watching every second of it. Marcus Thorne had built his real estate empire on a single philosophy, that the world was divided into people who owned things and people who were in the way. He was 47, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of confidence that comes not from competence but from never having been told no by anyone who could actually back it up. His company, Thorne Capital Group, had swallowed 6 city blocks in the past 2 years, aging apartment buildings cleared out, elderly tenants relocated, communities dissolved and replaced with luxury developments whose lobbies looked exactly like the one Sarah was standing in now, marble floors, towering glass, cold light, and the distinct architectural message that people like you were not the intended audience. He had acquired the Caldwell Arms 3 weeks prior. The tenants had 30 days on paper. He planned to give them considerably less. Sarah was the last one who had not yet signed the relocation agreement. She was also the one he had decided to make an example of. You have 24 hours to vacate, Ms. Vance. He held the papers out not as an offer but as a dismissal, his eyes already moving past her towards something more interesting. People like you don't belong in this zip code anymore. Frankly, you never did. Sarah looked down at the papers. She did not take them immediately. She let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds, a small, precise act of refusal, and then she lifted her eyes to the men standing behind him. 4 of them. Perfectly still. Watching her with expressions that gave nothing away except, to the trained eye, absolute readiness. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. Something that, had Thorne been paying attention to anything other than his own reflection in the glass behind her, might have given him pause. She took the papers. I'll be in touch, she said. Her voice was completely calm. She turned and walked toward the exit. Her heels were soft on the marble. She did not look back. Behind her, one of the 4 men in dark suits, the one closest to the pillar, slowly lifted his phone and typed 2 words into an encrypted message thread. He's moved. 3 seconds later, in a high-rise 40 blocks north, a phone on a corner desk illuminated. Kang Dae-hyun read the message. He set the phone face down. He folded his hands on the desk. And he waited. Marcus Thorne was still smiling when Sarah walked out. He turned back to his assistant, a thin, efficient man named Pollard who carried a tablet like a shield, and straightened his cufflinks with the particular satisfaction of someone who had just checked a minor inconvenience off a list. How many left? He asked. Just her, Pollard said. All other tenants have signed. Good. Thorne buttoned his jacket and cast one final glance at the lobby doors, already closing behind the woman in the cream cardigan. Get the demolition permits filed by end of day. I want groundbreaking photos before the month is out. He said it the way a man says take out the trash. Clean. Final. Unbothered. He had already forgotten her name. That was the thing about Marcus Thorne. He moved through the world at a velocity that left no room for consequence. In 20 years of development deals, he had displaced hundreds of tenants, dissolved dozens of communities, and cleared entire city blocks with nothing more than legal paperwork and a smile built for television cameras. No one had ever made him slow down. No one had ever made him look back. The city rewarded men like him with ribbon-cutting ceremonies and magazine covers and the quiet gratitude of politicians who needed donors and asked no questions. He rode the elevator back to his top-floor office and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the skyline with his hands clasped behind his back. From up here, the city looked exactly the way he liked it, orderly, geometric, stripped of the mess of actual people. The Caldwell Arms neighborhood sat 12 blocks east, a gray smudge between 2 glass towers. In 6 months, there would be a 3rd tower where that smudge used to be. His name would be on the building. His name was always on the building. She'll fold by tonight, he told Pollard, who had followed him up without being asked. They always do. Once they realize there's no one coming to help them. Pollard nodded and made a note. Thorne poured himself 2 fingers of scotch even though it was barely noon and stood there feeling the particular pleasure of a man who confuses the absence of resistance with the absence of danger. He did not think about the 4 men who had been standing in his lobby. He had barely registered them, just faces, just furniture, just part of the background of a building he now owned. He did not think about the way the woman had looked at them before she took the papers. He did not think about the 3 seconds of silence she had made him stand in. He finished his drink, set the glass down, and moved on to his next meeting. 40 blocks north, 4 men were already repositioning. And in apartment 4B of the Caldwell Arms, Seraphina Vance sat on the edge of her bed, looked at the eviction notice in her hands, and made a decision. She would handle this herself. The Caldwell Arms looked exactly the way it always had, a little tired, a little worn, beautiful in the way that only things built for living rather than impressing ever managed to be. Sarah climbed the stairs to the 4th floor because the elevator was having one of its bad days, her hand trailing the painted iron railing, her footsteps quiet in the dim hallway. Mrs. Okafor's television murmured behind door 4A. Someone on the floor below was cooking something with garlic and onion that smelled like a memory. The radiator knocked once, as if in greeting. She unlocked her door and stepped inside. The apartment was small by any measurement that didn't account for the life packed carefully into it. A bookshelf along the far wall, double-stacked and overfull. A kitchen table with 2 chairs, one of which held a cardigan she'd been meaning to fold for 3 days. Plants on the windowsill, real ones, thriving, because she had decided years ago that if she was going to live in a small space, it would at least be a living one. On the narrow shelf beside the door sat a framed photograph of a woman with Sarah's same eyes and a wider smile, a string of dried flowers hanging above it, faded now to the color of old paper. Her mother. Gone 4 years. Still somehow the first thing Sarah looked at when she came home. She set her bag on the table and stood in the center of the room for a moment, still holding the eviction papers. Then she folded them once, deliberately, and set them beside the bag. She changed out of her work clothes, put the kettle on, and moved through her evening routine with the calm of someone who has survived enough hard things to know that panic is simply wasted energy. Only once, only after the tea was made and she was sitting at the table in the blue evening quiet, did she reach up and pull the chain from beneath her collar. The ring caught the lamplight as it settled in her palm. Black gold, dark diamond, Korean characters engraved on the inner band so small you'd need to know they were there to find them. A private language. A private life. She held it for a long moment, rubbing her thumb across the familiar weight of it, and then she tucked it back beneath her shirt. She did not open the nightstand drawer. Not yet. But she was aware of it, the way you are aware of a door in a quiet house. She knew exactly what was inside. The matte black phone, fully charged because she had never once let it die, connected to a private encrypted network that bounced signals across 4 countries before it reached the only number stored in it. She finished her tea. Outside, on the street below her window, a black sedan sat parked at the curb with its engine off and its lights dark. It had been there since she arrived home. It would be there when she woke up. It always was. It started small, the way cruelty usually does. The hot water went first. Sarah turned the shower tap on a Wednesday morning and stood waiting for the warmth that never came. She showered anyway, cold, efficient, unbothered, and called the building's new management line on her way to work. No answer. She left a message in the same measured tone she used with difficult patients at the clinic. Professional. Documented. The kind of voice that assumed good faith while quietly preparing for its absence. By Thursday, the heat was gone too. By Friday evening, when she came home to find 2 men she had never seen before leaning against the wall outside her door, thick-necked, arms crossed, wearing the specific expression of people paid to make other people uncomfortable, she understood that Marcus Thorne was no longer working through legal channels. He had moved into a different vocabulary entirely. "Ma'am," one of them said, not moving. Sarah looked at them both with the same calm she had given Thorne in the lobby. "Gentlemen," she replied, and unlocked her door, and went inside. She cooked dinner. She ate at her table. She did not look at the nightstand. Then, at 9:17 on a Friday night, sitting in her coat because the apartment had dropped to a temperature that made her breath visible, she opened the drawer. The satellite phone was cool in her hand. She turned it over once, then dialed. It rang twice. That was all it ever took. "Sarah." His voice was low, unhurried, carrying that particular quality of stillness she had never been able to fully describe to herself, like the surface of deep water. He said her name the way people say the names of things they are careful with. "I know you already know," she said. There was no point in pretending otherwise. She had seen the sedan outside. She knew how his network worked. A pause. "Yes." "Then I need you to hear me clearly." She kept her voice even, though the cold air in the room made her chest tight. "Stay out of it. I can handle this." Another pause. Longer this time. She could hear him breathing, measured and slow, on the other end of a signal that had bounced across 4 countries to reach him. "He has men outside your door," Dae-hyun said. Not an argument. Just a fact, placed quietly on the table between them. "I have men outside my building too," she replied. "Yours." The silence that followed held something she couldn't quite name. Not agreement. Not surrender. Something closer to a man pressing his thumb against the spine of a closed book, feeling the tension of the pages inside. "How long?" he asked finally. "I'll tell you when I need you." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll be here." She ended the call. Set the phone on the nightstand. Pulled her coat tighter. Outside, The sedan's engine stayed cold and quiet all night long. The feed was sharp and silent, the way Daehyun preferred most things. 4 cameras. Sera's hallway, the building entrance, the street facing east, and the street facing west. They ran continuously on a private monitor built into the right panel of his desk, small enough that a visitor sitting across from him would mistake it for a screensaver. No visitor had ever sat in that chair long enough to look closely. Daehyun did not cultivate the kind of relationships that required comfortable seating. He watched the 2 men outside her door rotate shifts at midnight. Thorne's men, he had their names, their records, and the name of the intermediary who had hired them, all of which had landed in his secured inbox within 6 hours of their arrival. He knew more about Marcus Thorne's operation than Thorne's own lawyers did. This was not a boast. It was simply the condition of the world he had built, one where information moved toward him the way water finds the lowest point, quietly and without effort. He stood at his window now with his hands clasped behind his back, the city arranged below him in its nighttime geometry of light and dark. His office was sparse in the way that spoke not of austerity but of absolute control, nothing present that had not been deliberately chosen, nothing absent that was needed. The only warmth in the room came from the small framed photograph on the corner of his desk. He did not look at it. He didn't need to. He knew every detail of it already, the way you know the geography of a place you have returned to so many times it lives inside your body. His phone had not moved since the call ended 3 hours ago. Stay out of it. I can handle this. He had heard those words before, in different forms, across 7 years of marriage conducted in the careful language of 2 people who loved each other and understood exactly how dangerous that love could be. Sera's independence was not a flaw he tolerated. It was one of the reasons she was his. She had chosen him with full knowledge of what he was, and she had also chosen to remain her own woman, to build a life that did not run on his shadow. He had always respected that. He had built the arrangement around it. But respect had a threshold. He was honest enough with himself to know that. He turned back to the monitor. The hallway feed showed Thorne's man shift his weight, scratch his jaw, glance at his phone. Ordinary. Bored. A man who had never once considered that the woman behind that door might be the most protected person in the city. Daehyun studied his face on the screen for a long moment. Then he pressed the intercom. Min Jun. Sir. Immediate. Quiet. Bring the car around. Not yet. A pause. But bring it around. She knew before she opened the door. It was something in the air of the hallway, a disturbance, the way a room feels different after someone has been in it who shouldn't have been. The door itself looked untouched. The lock showed no obvious damage. But it swung open with a half-second less resistance than usual, and that was enough. Sera stood in the doorway and took it in without moving. The apartment had been gone through with the specific thoroughness of people who wanted to make a point rather than find anything. Drawers pulled and upended. Bookshelf swept clean, novels fanned across the floor like fallen things. Her kitchen cabinet doors left hanging open, the contents of the shelves redistributed across the counter and the floor in a way that said we were here with absolute clarity. Her mother's photograph had been knocked from its shelf. The frame had cracked against the floor, the glass split clean across the image. Sera crossed the room and crouched down and picked it up. She held it carefully, the broken glass held in place by the frame's backing, her mother's face still intact beneath the fracture. She exhaled through her nose, slow, controlled, and set it gently on the shelf. Then she saw the music box. It had lived on the narrow shelf beside her bed for 11 years. A small lacquered thing, dark wood inlaid with a spray of pale flowers, Korean in design, a gift from Daehyun from the early years, before their life together had grown complicated by everything it had grown complicated by. It had played 8 seconds of a melody she no longer remembered the name of. She had wound it every Sunday morning out of a habit that had long ago crossed the border from routine into ritual. What remained of it now was in 3 pieces on the floor beside her nightstand. Not dropped. Not fallen. Broken, deliberately, cleanly, the kind of damage that requires intention and a specific downward force. The small mechanism inside, the delicate brass cone that had held the melody, lay bent and separate from the body of the box, silent in a way that felt permanent. Sera sat down on the edge of her bed. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of anyone in a very long time, and she was alone, and she still did not cry. She sat with her hands on her knees and looked at the 3 pieces of the broken thing on her floor and let the feeling move through her the way you let a wave move through you, fully, without fighting it, until it passed. It took approximately 40 seconds. Then she reached across the nightstand and picked up the satellite phone. She dialed. It rang once. Sarah. Daehyun. Her voice was quiet. Completely steady. He broke the music box. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. I'm coming home. She held the phone in her lap for a long moment after the call ended. I'm coming home. 3 words. 11 letters. The weight of them settled over the apartment like a weather change, something in the pressure of the air shifting, the quality of the silence becoming different. Heavier. The kind of quiet that precedes something rather than follows it. Sarah set the phone on the nightstand and looked around the room. At the displaced books. The cracked photograph frame. The 3 pieces of the music box on the floor. She had spent 7 years keeping these 2 halves of her life carefully separated, the woman she was in this apartment, in this neighborhood, at this clinic, and the woman she was on a chain around her neck, in an encrypted phone line, in the private architecture of a life most people would not believe if she described it. She had kept that wall standing through discipline and pride and the genuine belief that her independence was worth the effort of maintaining it. Marcus Thorne had walked into her home and broken that wall along with everything else. She stood up. She began to clean. Not because she was erasing evidence, she had already photographed everything, methodically, room by room, before she sat down, but because it was something to do with her hands, and Sarah had always processed the hardest things through motion. She righted the bookshelf. She gathered the novels from the floor and stacked them. She swept the kitchen. She did not touch the music box. She left its 3 pieces exactly where they were, in the middle of the floor, because some things deserved to be witnessed. 40 blocks north, Daehyun was already moving. He had set the phone down with the same stillness he brought to everything, but the stillness was different now, not the stillness of restraint but of a man who has released something he had been holding back for a very long time. He pressed the intercom without sitting down. Min Jun. Sir. The response came instantly, as it always did. The car I asked you to bring around. A pause so brief it barely existed. It's time. The line clicked. Within 4 minutes, he could hear the quiet orchestration of his organization beginning to move, the specific, practiced sound of men who had been waiting for exactly this and knew precisely what to do now that it had arrived. Phones lifted. Routes confirmed. A fleet of vehicles that had been sitting at various points across the city began to reorient themselves around a single fixed point. A 6-story brick building on the outer edge of a neighborhood the rest of the city had decided wasn't worth remembering. Daehyun took his jacket from the back of his chair and put it on. He straightened his cuffs. He picked up the framed photograph from the corner of his desk, the woman in the cream cardigan, laughing at something just off camera, and looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he set it down, and walked out of his office, and did not look back. Marcus Thorne had chosen a Saturday morning deliberately. Saturdays were good for cameras. People were home, which meant witnesses, which meant the kind of organic spectacle that played well on the local news cycle, the bold developer, the progress of the city, the inevitable march of development. He had done this before, at 3 other sites across the city, and he had learned that the best way to silence any remaining resistance was to make the ending feel already written. Show up with enough machinery and enough media and the story tells itself. Nobody argues with a bulldozer. He arrived at 8:15 in a black town car, stepping out onto the cracked sidewalk in front of the Caldwell Arms with the ease of a man arriving at his own celebration. His publicist had arranged 2 local news crews, both already set up on the opposite curb with cameras rolling. A small cluster of onlookers had gathered, neighbors, mostly, standing at a cautious distance with the particular posture of people who know something is being taken from them and have not yet decided whether to say so out loud. Thorne buttoned his jacket and smiled at the nearest camera with the practiced warmth of someone who had long ago learned to perform sincerity without producing it. Today marks the beginning of something extraordinary for this community, he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch it cleanly. Modern housing. Economic investment. A future this neighborhood deserves. Pollard stood at his shoulder with a tablet, relaying confirmations. The demolition crew was staged 2 blocks over, permits were filed, the 2 officers he had placed on a generous retainer were parked at the corner in a patrol car, present and cooperative. Everything was in order. Everything was exactly as planned. He turned toward the building and let his eyes travel up its 6 tired stories with the expression of a man already seeing something else in its place. Glass and steel and his name on the facade. He had been imagining it for months. Now he was 12 hours from making it real. The only outstanding variable was the woman in 4B. He was not particularly concerned. His men had been thorough. People broke under that kind of pressure, the cold, the fear, the message delivered through shattered belongings. They always did. He expected to find the apartment empty when he went upstairs. He expected a minor scene, at worst, tears, perhaps, a phone call to a lawyer she couldn't afford, the kind of resistance that collapses the moment you stop pretending to listen. He had not considered any other possibility. This was, perhaps, the most defining fact about Marcus Thorne, not his greed, not his cruelty, but the absolute, architectural confidence of a man who had never once been genuinely surprised by consequences. He checked his watch. He nodded to the crew. He started toward the entrance. Behind him, the news cameras rolled. And 2 blocks away, the first black sedan turned the corner. The first sedan parked. Then the second. Then the third. By the time Thorne reached the building's entrance and turned to check on the noise behind him, the street was no longer recognizable. Black luxury vehicles, identical in make, identical in color, moving with the coordinated precision of something rehearsed, had filled the block from one end to the other in absolute silence. No horns. No urgency. Just the quiet, inexorable fact of their presence, the way a tide doesn't announce itself before it covers the shore. The news cameras swung away from Thorne without being asked. The doors opened. The men who stepped out did so unhurriedly, adjusting their cuffs, taking their positions on the sidewalk with the calm of people who had done this before and understood exactly what their stillness communicated. Dark suits. Earpieces. Faces that gave away nothing except competence. One after another until the sidewalk held a number that made Thorne's 2 borrowed police officers go very quiet in their patrol car and make no move to exit it. The demolition crew, staged 2 blocks over, did not advance. Pollard said something that Thorne didn't hear. He was watching the street with an expression he had never worn before, the specific, unfamiliar look of a man encountering something that his existing categories cannot comfortably hold. Then the last car door opened, and the crowd went still. Kang Dae-hyun stepped out. He was not a large man in the way that Thorne understood largeness, the broad shoulders, the deliberate physical dominance that Thorne himself performed through posture and expensive tailoring. He was lean, composed, somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of face that was difficult to read at any distance and probably just as difficult up close. He wore a dark suit with the ease of someone who had never in his life dressed to impress anyone. His hair was pushed back from his face. He wore no visible jewelry except, on his left hand, a ring of black gold with a single dark stone. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the Caldwell arms, all 6 tired, imperfect stories of it, with an expression that did not belong on the face of a man arriving at a crumbling apartment building in a struggling neighborhood. It was the expression of a man arriving somewhere that mattered. Somewhere that was, in every way that counted, his. Then he walked toward it. The crowd parted without being asked. His men fell into formation behind him, not rushing, not performing, simply moving the way bodies move around a gravitational center. His footsteps were unhurried on the cracked sidewalk. He did not look at the news cameras. He did not look at the bulldozer. He did not look at Thorne. Not yet. Thorne stood at the building's entrance and watched him come and felt, for the first time in 20 years of absolute certainty, something cold and structural shift in the foundation of his confidence. Dae-hyun found Thorne exactly where he expected to, standing in the lobby, surrounded by the marble and glass he had mistaken for permanence, wearing the last remnants of his confidence like a coat that no longer fit. He walked in without slowing. 2 of his men positioned themselves at the entrance behind him. The rest remained outside, which was, in its own way, a more effective statement than bringing them in. The lobby felt different with Dae-hyun in it, not louder, not more crowded, but smaller. Rearranged around a new center of gravity. Thorne opened his mouth. Mr. Thorne. Dae-hyun's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. He stopped at a distance that was not quite comfortable and clasped his hands in front of him. I won't take much of your time. Thorne closed his mouth. Something in the tone, that particular unhurried courtesy, was more disorienting than aggression would have been. He had a script for aggression. He had no script for this. I think there's been some misunderstanding, Thorne started carefully. This is a legally acquired property and I have every right. You borrowed $43 million from Hansun Capital Partners to fund your last 3 developments. Dae-hyun said it the way you state a weather fact. Your current project, the tower you intend to build on this site, is secured through a bridge loan held by Meridian Pacific Holdings. Your expansion into the waterfront district is contingent on a zoning variance currently under review by a city councilman whose campaign received significant support from the Daewoo Foundation. A pause. I own all 3. The lobby was completely silent. Thorne's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then disbelief, then the beginning of a comprehension so unpleasant that his body seemed to resist arriving at it fully. The woman you sent men into, Dae-hyun continued, his voice never shifting in register, whose utilities you cut, whose home you had destroyed, her name is Seraphina Vance. Another pause, smaller this time. She is my wife. The word landed in the marble lobby and did not echo. It didn't need to. Thorne said nothing. There was nothing to say. The entire architecture of his confidence, the permits, the cameras outside, the borrowed officers in the patrol car, had just been revealed as scaffolding around a building that no longer existed. Dae-hyun reached into his jacket and produced a single folded document. He held it out with the same gesture Thorne had used in this very lobby 1 week ago, pressing papers into a woman's hands as a form of dismissal. The symmetry was precise and, Sarah would later say, entirely intentional. Sign the building over to her. Full title, no encumbrances, by end of business Monday. He held Thorne's eyes with a gaze that was utterly calm and utterly final. Or by Tuesday, you will not exist in this city's ledger in any form that matters. He let the document hang in the air between them. This time, the silence lasted considerably longer than 3 seconds. Marcus Thorne signed the document at 4:47 p.m. on a Monday. He did it alone, in his office, with no cameras and no publicist and no Pollard standing at his shoulder with a tablet. His hand was steady, he was too proud for it not to be, but the pen moved across the page with none of the confidence that had carried him through 20 years of signatures on 20 years of acquisitions. When it was done he set the pen down and sat for a long time looking at nothing in particular, turning over in his mind the sequence of events that had delivered him to this desk, this moment, this diminishment. He would spend a great deal of time in the months that followed doing exactly that. Turning it over. Looking for the error. What he would struggle to accept, and perhaps never fully would, was that the error had not been tactical. It had not been a miscalculation of resources or a failure of intelligence or a poorly timed legal maneuver. The error had been philosophical. It had been the assumption, so deeply held that he had never once examined it, that a person's power could be read from their clothing, their address, the neighborhood they lived in, the bag on their shoulder. He had looked at Seraphina Vance and seen a woman with nothing. He had seen an easy problem. He had seen someone who could be moved without consequence because she appeared to have no one behind her and nothing worth protecting her with. He had been wrong about all 3. The Caldwell Arms did not become a luxury tower. It became something quieter and considerably more permanent, a renovated building with functional elevators and reliable heat and a community room on the ground floor that Mrs. Okafor used on Tuesday evenings for a cooking class that nobody had asked for and everybody attended. The tenants who had signed Thorne's relocation agreements were offered the chance to return. Most of them did. Sarah kept apartment 4B. She repaired the photograph frame. She had the music box restored by a craftsman who worked from a small shop in Koreatown and who asked no questions and did extraordinary work. The melody it played when she wounded on Sunday mornings was exactly as she remembered. The ring stayed on the chain around her neck during the week, because that was her choice, and she had always been a woman who understood the difference between hiding something and simply keeping it private. There is a particular kind of power that announces itself loudly, that arrives in tailored suits and town cars and the legal vocabulary of ownership. The world tends to recognize this kind of power because it is designed to be recognized. It is built for visibility. It demands acknowledgement the way certain people demand to be addressed by their full title in every room they enter. And then there is the other kind. The kind that lives quietly in a small apartment with thriving plants on the windowsill and a worn crossbody bag and a calm that does not break under pressure because it was never fragile to begin with. The kind that does not need to announce itself because it was never performing for an audience. The kind that a certain category of person will always underestimate, right up until the moment the floor disappears beneath them, because they confused simplicity with weakness and silence with surrender. Marcus Thorne had made that mistake. He would not be the last. But somewhere in a city that had not yet learned to look carefully at the people it overlooked, in a fourth-floor apartment with a repaired music box playing 8 seconds of a melody on a Sunday morning, Seraphina Vance drank her tea and let the sound fill the room. And the ring on the chain around her neck caught the light, just once, and was still.